Welcome to a premiere, first of all, an inaugural podcast here on your new favorite channel, station, subscription option, whatever you do to get information into your ears. You're on Putschcast, and if you don't know what that means, you'll have to find out. But putsch is basically the German word for a coup d'etat. It's an old word. I think it goes back to Swiss German, correct me if I'm wrong, and it became widely used in the 19th century and then entered the English language, I believe, around the 1920s when there was a few putsches in then Weimar Germany. And that's the title of our podcast. And the great thing about this podcast is I'm not by myself. I've got people here with me in the interrogation room of Putschcast. Those people are today David.
Hi, Oliver.
And David Shields is your full name.
That is my full name.
And is this your first podcast?
It is my first podcast. I've done a little bit of amateur radio, but this is the first time in an interrogation room talking about politics.
Yeah, make sure you put your hands under your legs.
Yes, sorry, I won't forget to do that.
For all insiders, that's for the dogs later.
Yeah.
And also, we've got Jaron Sutton with us.
Hey, Oliver. How you going?
Jaron, thank you also for joining us on the first episode of Putschcast. It is a first for all of us, and I want to say a big thank you to the entire audience for being a bit lenient with us if it's not all perfect, a little bit glitchy. But I think we've got a very, very big program ahead of us. We will be talking about a man who has written history in just under a year. And this man comes from a country that's been in the news many, many times, and unfortunately always for the wrong reasons. The country we're talking about is Syria. Now, there are two men to talk about, one of them being the one who's no longer there. No one really knows where he is. There's rumors. We're talking about Bashar al-Assad, of course, the former president of Syria who inherited the title. And I'm really, really, really glad to have you today, Jaron. And I also want to acknowledge that I had a guest invited. His name is Roger. Hopefully he listens to us now. He is Syrian. He lives in Australia and has very strong opinions, like many Syrians, about the situation. Of course, we're talking about the new president of Syria. And Roger told me, who the hell is this guy? Like, we followed the news, and even as a Syrian, I barely had him on my radar. And within a few months or weeks even, back in December 2024, we were told, hey, here you go. This is your new president after 60 years of Assad rule. And I think there's a lot to explore here. If you're out there listening, you've got feedback, let us know. Send us an email, putschcast@gmail.com. And we will definitely pick up this topic again. Syria has so much to explore, and we will do that in following episodes. But today we're trying to focus on the last year to really understand how did this regime collapse and who's in charge now and what might the future hold. Today's Putschcast episode is brought to you by Motorcycle Rental Melbourne, your ticket to an amazing adventure on two wheels across Australia. Motorcycle Rental Melbourne is not just a rental company, it is your gateway for the most spectacular way to explore the fifth continent. To enjoy winding coastal roads and challenging mountain passes, or the never-ending wilderness of the outback. You can just rent a motorcycle or book a self-guided tour, complete with an itinerary and accommodation. Whether you like adventure bikes, cruises, or anything in between, visit the website motorcyclerentalmelbourne.com.au. And don't forget to mention Putschcast for a 10% discount on your next rental. Book your bike today and find your freedom. Terms and conditions apply. Introductions first. David, just your background. You've got a professional interest in history and politics.
I have studied politics and history in my university days. I'm now a secondary school teacher and have been teaching senior history on and off, but also English as well. And I have an abiding interest in the Middle East and have been reading up on Syria in preparation for this.
Yeah, I'll ask you in a second what your background knowledge was, but maybe let's start with Jaron. Jaron, you've got more insights than the two of us together. What is your background?
Yeah, so I think my interest in Syria comes from a year that I spent living there before the, what people refer to as the Arab Spring in 2009, 2010. I went to Syria to study classical Arabic at the University of Damascus, spent a year there and left shortly before, the Syrian revolution began. So that's the sort of interest that I've taken in the country since then. And of course, with recent events, taken quite a close interest in what's happened. But, since my time in Syria, I've lived in Egypt as well, where I studied Arabic as well on a scholarship, and worked in Australia in the higher education sector.
Yeah, and you never really let go, do you? After that experience, you probably kept following the events on the ground, and
that's right.
Still in touch with some people as well?
Yeah, I've got lots of Syrian friends, and especially early days in the revolution. I took quite a close interest in it, and everyone was expecting, that maybe the regime would fall, and then it just would never fall, and it never felt. And then I think the world kind of moved on a little bit. Certainly, the media did.
David, just let's start with you. We're trying to make this a bit of a Putschcast tradition. What did you know about the conflict before this topic came up?
As a follower of international news, I had an understanding of the Arab Spring and the knock-on effects of that across the Middle East. Also an understanding of the challenge that was posed to the Assad regime and the response. After the violent spasms of the first few years, it seemed that the Western media has taken their eye off. So it was a massive surprise, I think, just as a casual observer, to see this unravel so quickly, because I suppose I expected that the foreign powers, again, that you alluded to, would step in and sandbag their proxy in the Middle East, and that didn't happen. So it's going to be interesting to talk about it.
You just mentioned the word knock-on effect, but the knock-off effect is that regimes changed almost in every country along the coastline, right? Starting in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, obviously, but Syria became a different story. I think that's really, really interesting to explore. And let's start there, because Jaron, you were in Syria before the war. Maybe tell us what it was like. Obviously, you have a Western perspective, but you do speak Arabic, so that gives you an insight on what people are talking about on the streets. And what was Syria pre-war?
I mean, as an international Arabic student, it was amazing. It was the kind of place to be as an Arabic student at the time, along with places like Cairo and Morocco, maybe. I enrolled at the University of Damascus, where a lot of the European universities would send their Arabic students to study. So, you'd go to university every day, you'd be mixing with Norwegians and Brits and Americans and Germans and people from all over the world. So there was a really nice scene going on there in terms of the Arabic language expat scene. I didn't know Arabic well at that time. I was sort of starting at the bottom level, and I was learning formal Arabic, which is not the Arabic that people speak on the street, even if everyone understands it. And it's the sort of media Arabic that you would hear if you tune into Al Jazeera, for example, or read a newspaper. So I wasn't sort of too clued into what Syrians were thinking. And of course, what Syrians were thinking at the time, they may not or wanted to have expressed to me anyway, because there was such a climate of fear in the country around any discussions. I remember once a rather naive friend of mine, a Norwegian, asked a Syrian in our company whether people who put the sticker of Bashar al-Assad and Hafiz al-Assad, his father, on the back window of their car. A lot of the cars in Damascus would have pictures of Bashar and Hafiz. And he asked, are people putting their stickers on the car because they really support the regime, or are they putting it on there just to sort of demonstrate that they're, compliant and all this sort of thing? And the response that he got was, please don't ask that question. It's not the sort of question that we should be discussing. So
yeah,
there was definitely a climate of fear around about political discussions, and that makes it hard. You don't really want to broach those conversations with people because they're the ones at risk, not you, when you go there.
I think that is really important for Westerners to understand, as naive as you might be. But if you do travel in a country that is a dictatorship, let alone an oppressive one, that might be a naive question for you. But always keep in mind what this could mean, the repercussions for the person you're asking, let alone expecting to respond to that. Because it might not just be them who are at risk, but also their families, friends, and life. But going back to that, did you have some sort of briefing or pre-introduction before entering the country? Was there a guide you received from the university of how to behave? Because I've done a course of that before for a different country, but where you really get the basic norms of do not ask those questions except if this happens, even though it's not a standard in the West. But did you have any briefing? Or
I didn't know much about Syria at all, and I was pretty apprehensive at the time. I did actually pay a company that specialised in sort of housing students who are coming to Damascus and helping them settle into the country, getting them their residency permits, for example, and taking you to the hospital because you had to get an AIDS test to show the government that you could stay in the country, that sort of thing. My entry into the country was made easier because I was picked up at the airport by someone. I had housing already set up when I arrived there, and all the sort of administrative aspects of settling down in Damascus were looked after, which was nice. And then a couple of months in that house, I ended up moving out with a friend into a different suburb and sort of was doing things my own way at that point. So I was politically aware enough about the political situation in the country that it was a dictatorship. And I was more focused at that point on Arabic. And of course, Syria's got such a rich history as well. So I was attracted by all the sites that were on offer and started traveling around the country and those sorts of things. So my experience of Syria at that point was probably as a language student and as a tourist living in the country. I wasn't so focused on the politics, and there hadn't been a lot of change in the country politically, so it wasn't as if there'd been a revolution 2 years earlier and I was moving there and there were all these discussions going on the street and, there was a revolutionary fervour in the air. Although in hindsight, once I left the country and what happened, I did start to reflect a bit more deeply on, I wonder if I missed some things or should I have taken more of an interest in this at the time.
And just confirming, you left before the insurgency started. Just give us the time frame again. When was
Sure.
that?
So I arrived in Syria in August 2009 and I left in October 2010. And then I think, the Arab Spring really broke out in late December, early January, and then in Syria itself in March. So, it was like 4 or 5 months before things really broke out.
I was going to ask earlier, correct me if I'm misremembering this, but I think after you returned, you told me that at some point living there, you were visited by the security services who were just checking that you were who you were supposed to be, or that you were somebody who is an international student and you had no other sort of nefarious business in the country. Is that correct?
There were people around that were suggested this person is someone who monitors the activity of students in a lot of the Arabic students who go to Damascus would live in the old city, and there was one person in particular who was pointed out, this guy's basically monitoring student activity.
A political chaperone.
Yeah, but there were other characters, other Western students who did receive attention and were told to sort of start behaving themselves for various reasons. They might have just been living life a little bit too openly, perhaps partying too hard. I'm not quite sure, but I know of one circumstance where one student was basically approached, taken aside, and said, "You need to rein it in a bit."
Obviously, we're in Damascus, which is always different to being somewhere 500 kilometers away in a desert. It was a very secular society, like political oppression aside, but there's often countries where you then, like you just said, you can still go out, have drinks, enjoy life.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. So basically the situation was if you were operating in sort of the Christian parts of town, you could, which was centered around the old city of Damascus largely, at least within Damascus. A lot of the old city were Christian communities, and that's where a lot of the tourism in Damascus is centered as well. So you could, walk into the old city and have a beer on the street. There's parks in the old city where people were drinking in open, and that's the sort of thing, having recently returned from Egypt, that you wouldn't see even in somewhere like Egypt.
What's always quoted, and it's very well documented, is the diversity of cultures and religions inside of Syria, knowing obviously that Syria is not a natural entity, that it's a hangover product of World War I. Assad was a member of the Alawites, which is, for me, as I understand it, a very liberal form of, is it Islam or is it Alawites? Which box could you put them in?
That's a good question. It depends who you ask, but it's often described as a sort of an offshoot of Shia Islam.
Okay.
So, you might ask some people who don't recognize Shia as Islam, and then if you have an offshoot of Shia Islam, then you're even further removed from the original product. So,
which and then again explains the close ties to Hezbollah and Iran later on, because they obviously had some sort of connections.
Yeah.
You've got the Druze, you've got various Christian denominations, and then you've got Sunni Arabs, obviously.
Yeah.
And
Kurds.
It's a big mix.
It is.
When living in Syria, how prominent was that at the time? Did that matter?
Yeah, not so. I didn't notice it so much in the professions. It was more so, different parts of town that you would go to. There's definitely Christian areas. You go, okay, I'm in a Christian area now. Things are a bit more liberal. The women aren't wearing the hijab in this area, that kind of thing. When I first moved to Damascus, I was living in what you would consider a very conservative suburb called El Midan. And I had some interesting interactions there with some local residents. One in particular, I was walking home from the market one night with some friends, and your religious background is a topic of curiosity in the Middle East generally as a Westerner.
Yeah.
Especially if you're studying Arabic, there's an assumption, and a lot of Muslims will go to the Middle East to learn Arabic because in order to read the Quran in its original language, you need to learn Arabic. So there's an assumption or a suspicion maybe that if you're an Arabic student, you might also be Muslim. So people will ask you if you're Muslim. And then if you say no, then the next sort of logical answer is you're a Christian. I'm neither.
Yes.
So
then you had the difficult discussions.
Yeah. So
I remember them too. Tell me about it.
Well, in this particular instance, I was honest. I said, no, I'm not Muslim and I'm not Christian. I'm not a believer. And this man sort of indicated, he made some sort of flame, gestured with his fingers to suggest the flames of hell, and that I was heading straight to hell when I died. And I thought, okay, well, it's nice to meet you, but I've got to get home. I've lost count of the amount of times that people have asked me about my religious background, which never happens here in Australia. So I've sort of just defaulted these days to just saying that I'm a Christian. I mean, I'm a culturally Christian person. I come from a culturally Christian background. So I think it's the easiest way for me.
I've landed on the same response in my experience, because I was asked a few times as well. And I then had to explain what an atheist was. Once I did, that was the worst thing ever, because they even said, I prefer if you're Christian, I prefer if you're Jew, but not believing in God is the worst thing you can do.
It really is, yeah.
This might sound peculiar to some people, but I think it's really important to understand the role of religion in the Middle East, and that it has a different meaning to what it does in the West, where, like you just said, it doesn't even matter. No one ever asks it. And then religion is something you do on Sunday morning, and that's about it. And then to understand how those sectarian violence can erupt, because it is really close to people's heart, but obviously it also gets manipulated. And, it's a political tool, obviously, for many, many people. Jaron, it was great just to hear from you about your time in Syria, and also what life was like before the war. Assad II was in power. We all know that he wasn't meant to be the president, but he did become the president because his older brother died in a car accident, surprisingly.
Right.
He then rose to power in 2000. He had his... Actually, should we call him doctor? Because he was a doctor, wasn't he? Dr. Bashar al-Assad.
He was an ophthalmologist.
Yeah, so he studied medicine and was there to help cure people, make them feel better, and some might argue he did quite the opposite. The Arab Spring broke out. One regime fell after another. There will be a separate Putschcast episode about Libya. Of course there will be, and of course also about the Muslim Brotherhood and whatever happened in Egypt, and I'd love to see you back for that too. And I think it's time to dive back in to discuss the man that took over from Assad, how he took over, who he is, and what chance he might give to Syria. Let's maybe start with something spectacular. This.
I guarantee to bring to justice everyone accountable and responsible for bloodshed. And in this context, Israeli strikes and attacks against my country continue, and Israeli policies contradict the international supporting position for Syria, which threatens new crises and struggles in our region. For this purpose, and in face of this aggression, Syria is committed to dialogue, and we're committed to the disengagement of forces agreement of 1974. And we call on the international community to stand beside us in the face of these attacks.
That was al-Sharaa, and he also has another name he goes under, his nom de guerre, which is
al-Julani.
At the General Assembly of the United Nations in the second half of 2025. In the second half of 2024, no one had a clue who he is. So what was your reaction to see this sudden change in personality, but also in status around the world?
I was like many people. I had no idea who the guy was, and sort of tried to get up to speed as quickly as I could. When the HTS, the Sharaa forces moved south and Assad fell, everyone was sort of scrambling to work out who this guy was. And at that point, there wasn't really a lot of information on him. He'd done some sort of long interviews a couple of years earlier, but since then he's done quite a lot of media. There's a lot of suspicion about him, understandably given his background, but there's also a lot of hope that he more than anyone else can lead Syria into something different.
And David, you mentioned before, so you follow in the news and sometimes you have a chat. Did you know who he was, let alone what his background was?
I think I was in the same boat as a lot of the media in terms of the speculative articles that were coming out about him, his intentions, and what they could possibly divine of the man based on his past. I suppose with these political players, and he's obviously a very serious one to have been able to seize power in a fractious state. What is really in his heart? Is he still a jihadist? Is he someone who wants to play that international game, be a statesman, and try to bring peace and some stability to Syria? It's going to be very interesting to find out. It seems like he's, so far at least, he's playing his cards quite well.
Just about his personal background. So al-Julani, his battle name, his Islamist name, he chose that name for a reason.
Yeah, he did. So his family is from the Golan Heights originally, and when he was born in Saudi Arabia, lived there for the first 7 years of his life, and then his family moved back to Damascus. And then when the America's war in Iraq happened in 2003, that's sort of where his career as a jihadist kicked off. So he moved, I think it was just a couple of weeks before the invasion of Iraq. He caught a bus to Baghdad and sort of joined the resistance against the American invasion.
Yeah, and he basically had a full-time career being a jihadist, isn't it? Like he would have been in his early 20s and then done nothing ever sinse.
Yeah.
Well, until last year, really.
That's right. His whole sort of political life and adult life has been framed by the war on terror essentially, in the context of the US invasion of Iraq and everything that sort of flowed from it.
Yeah.
He was arrested by the US in 2006, I think, in Iraq. So spent time in Abu Ghraib prison and various other prisons, and coincidentally was released by the Iraqi forces only a couple of days before the uprising began in Syria.
And maybe if you could just quickly explain the role of ISIS, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, because what I've heard is that he is actually the last highest-ranking Al-Qaeda official still alive, hence the $10 million bounty on his head until recently. So what do we know about him rising through the ranks and becoming the most powerful Islamist in Syria?
Yeah. Well, we know it's pretty clear that he was in contact with very senior Al-Qaeda leaders when he was in Iraq. So shortly after he was released in 2011, he was tasked, and remember Osama bin Laden was assassinated in May 2011, I think. So after Osama bin Laden was killed, his second in command took over, Zawahiri. Julani was tasked with basically going to Syria and setting up al-Qaeda's branch in Syria.
Yeah.
He was given $50,000, I read, and told you can go over there and set up al-Qaeda in Syria, which is what he did. A couple of years later, there was an attempt by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the head of Islamic State in Iraq, to sort of claim ownership of al-Qaeda in Syria. And he announced unilaterally the creation of what we now know as ISIL, so Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. That was rejected by the al-Qaeda leadership and by Julani, and that led to a break with Islamic State in Iraq. And then a couple of years after that, Julani sort of separated himself from al-Qaeda as a group, and that's when he sort of went out and branched off and set up his own organization.
But was there a catalyst for that? Something that prompted that, or was
I think
it geographic or
I
political?
think the catalyst is that he was starting to focus on Syria and creating a movement that was focused on Syria nationally rather than transnational jihad, which had sort of, they talk in the literature about the far enemy and the near enemy. And within al-Qaeda, I think at some point there was this sort of strategic decision, if we really want to get rid of these, and I'm paraphrasing their logic here, this is not me speaking, if we want to sort of get rid of these repressive regimes in the Middle East, then we need to go after the government, which in their mind was the United States, that is ultimately supporting these regimes. So the US was the far enemy, and the Arab sort of despotic regimes were the near enemy. So Julani, when he's come back to Syria and he's had this breach with al-Qaeda, I think he'd by that point become more of a, we just need to focus on taking out Assad and his proxies, Hezbollah and Iranian influence generally, and then sort of morphed over a number of years into more of a pragmatic figure who sort of set up this mini-state in the Idlib province and started sending out messages via his media interviews to the world to say, I'm someone that you can deal with. I'm not the guy that I used to be. And that's the sort of Julani that we've seen today, or Ahmed Hussein, as he's now known.
And what a success story. From prisoner to rebel leader, insurgent, terrorist, most wanted man, really, in Syria. What really blows my mind is how recent this all is. Like, we're talking less than 12 months ago. And now he speaks at the United Nations. We've just heard him talk. And let's have another listen to what he's got to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the very moment the former regime fell, we set out a clear strategic policy built upon three pillars: balanced diplomacy, security, stability, and economic development. We filled the power vacuum, called for an inclusive national dialogue, and announced a government of competence. We strengthened the principle of participation and established a National Commission for Transitional Justice and another for the missing, ensuring justice and fairness. We are now proceeding toward electing representatives of the people in the Legislative Council. We restructured civil and military institutions, dissolving all previous formations. Through intensive diplomatic activity, Syria restored its international relations and forged regional and global partnerships and achieved the gradual lifting of most sanctions, and we call now for the complete lifting of sanctions so that they no longer shackle the Syrian people.
That we heard from him again, rebel leader, terrorist turned statesman, and not even an elder statesman because he's in his early 40s. So theoretically, he's got many more years to turn Syria into something better.
Yeah, he's conquered a fractious state, and we're here recording a podcast. He's a bit younger than we are too. So that's a life of dedication well spent, I think, depending on what happens.
The whole world, including every secret service, is trying to figure this man out. I think, for my little information that I have, that most important is that he's not corrupt. I think that's the number one, that's a message that he needs to send. I was actually surprised that he moved into the same palace again, which is usually, when there's a change of leadership, that's a symbol that people trying to have a cut in comparison to the previous regime. The color of the flag has obviously changed. So the red was removed, is now green to get rid of that association with the Assad clan. And that is the juggle he has to be successful in.
Yeah, he's got a lot of work to do. There's a lot of moving parts. And I mean, I've listened to several of his long form interviews in Arabic, and it's clear he's a very intelligent person. And he's got a very good reading of geopolitics. He understands the situation he's in. He understands the situation Syria's in, and he understands how weak Syria is. And when you're running a weak state, you don't have many bargaining chips. So I think the position he's in now is that he's doing what he can to try and establish relationships on a let's just call them normal state-to-state relations, to build trade relationships with his neighbours, to have good relations with all his neighbours, including Israel, it seems. There's negotiations underway around a security agreement between those two countries, and that includes the West. The messaging that the government is putting out is pretty consistent. You know, we're not the guys we used to be. We're not jihadists. We're going to respect, the diversity of Syria's ethnic and religious makeup. We're going to respect the role of women in society. All the sort of messages that sound great to Western ears and also to many in the region as well. But at the same time, there's a real deep suspicion, and people understand also that politicians, that's part of their job really, is to say whatever they need to say in order to retain power and to keep power. So the big question out there around Ahmed Hussein at the moment is, how much do you trust really what this guy's about? Is he saying all the right things just to appease certain actors? But ultimately his game plan is something totally different. So that's the big question.
David, we mentioned, the juggle, that like incredibly skilled political talent that he needs to have, even to where he's now, but to move this country forward. There's questions, like I said, about corruptions, conspiracy theories of him being a puppet or bought by another power. I'm not sure if he is. I hope he's not, for the sake of the country, because that would obviously backfire. But then there's also the big question of legitimacy, and he's only been there for a few months, and there's already questions about elections, democracy. The first ever elections since Assad were held in early October. I think about 6,000 people were allowed to partake. I think it was more symbolism than anything else. But what we expect is from any other war-ravaged country, like just looking back the last 20, 30 years, who expects democratic elections to take place across the board after such a long 13-year war? I've looked it up again. I think it was 500,000 people that are considered dead over that time. Who would expect fair democratic elections after that?
The factors that precipitated Bashar al-Assad's departure, or the collapse of his regime, are now the millstone around the new regime's neck. And also, how do you reinvigorate an economy which had basically deteriorated into, you mentioned a mafia state before, or a kleptocracy. You have all of the elements and industries had basically been gutted. They no longer had functioning power grid, almost operating as a failed state. And as you mentioned, politically, you have to balance external actors, on the one hand, the US, and also then you have Russia and Iran, who were propping up the previous regime. If they choose, or would they choose, is there any strategic benefit for them to try to destabilize, undermine, or gain some political influence in Syria? I'm not sure, because if the heat from those different sides returns, how can this man possibly hold on?
Yeah, and I think you raise Russia, and I think there's a point to be made here about the sort of pragmatist that al-Sharaa is. He's in discussions. The new regime is in discussions with Russia about sort of keeping the relations alive, acknowledging the role that Russia had played in Syria over the last 15 years. It would be understandable for a new government to come in and go, look, we don't want anything to do with Russia anymore, you know.
Yeah. After so many bombs have been dropped.
That's right. We don't want to talk to you, but there's a sort of pragmatism about, look, we're in a new era here. We're going to have conversations with everyone, probably even the Iranians. And if we can come to an agreement that works for you and works for us and that serves Syrian interests, then, you know, we're happy to talk. That seems to be their approach.
That's how quickly things change. Foreign powers are crucial. Israel semi-invaded as soon as he took power, kept attacking, kept bombing, still of a sovereign state, you know, military airfields did a lot more destruction than the war did itself, just in a few days. There's the role of Qatar. Iran is very weak, obviously. But Russia, that's the interesting one. You've just mentioned it. And we do have a few quotes here on Putschcast. And one quote of the day comes from a certain man, David.
Okay. So, Jaron, I think Oliver would like you to try to guess who said this. There is no other solution to the Syrian crisis than strengthening the effective government structures and rendering them to help in fighting terrorism, but at the same time urging them to engage in positive dialogue with the rational opposition and conduct reform. Any ideas?
Was it Putin?
Correct.
Spot on.
It was.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
We haven't quite got the Putschcast award ready yet, but you would certainly win it. That was bullseye. Vladimir Putin on the 24th of September 2015. 10 years ago. That's what he said about the Assad regime. And I'm sure you could extract the same quote and use it for now, for the same situation now. Because fighting terrorism is still a thing. There's still pockets of what was considered terrorism until recently. Again, always depends on the definition. I think we started talking about who the man is, and we talked about foreign influence, but there's one man he needs to get along with. So does everyone else in the world. Here he is.
You couldn't make a phone call to Syria, so we did that, and I met the new leader of the country, and he's got a strong past. That would be very nice. He's got a strong past, but I liked him a lot. I think he'll be a great representative, and we'll see. You're going to have a strong past to put that one around. You cannot be a weak person. If you're a weak person, we would just be wasting time. So he's a strong guy, and I thought he was good, and let's see what happens. But we're going to give him a fighting chance by taking off the sanctions.
That was Donald Trump. Yes, you have to maybe not make friends with him, but you have to charm him in some way. NATO does it. I think everyone but Vladimir Putin is trying to charm Trump over the last year, and al-Sharaa certainly has to as well. Yeah, he called him a strong leader, and he has faith in him, and is also pragmatic and wants to work with al-Sharaa. Now, just about the man himself. So al-Sharaa, when I first saw him, before I saw the Islamist pictures of him, you know who he reminded me of? With his newly trimmed beard. And he was wearing a green jacket at the time. I thought of a very young Fidel Castro, a Fidel Castro of the Arab world. For me, this is the only thing missing was the
physical
cigar.
resemblance, or
the beard, the whole revolutionary spirit, taking down a regime within, but in a very, very unorthodox way, in a very short period of time.
Did you say 11 days, something like that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I just thought, yes, different continent, different era, different decade, different religion, different everything. But I think just the visual of this, and that's what I meant with the topic of corruption before. He needs to, and I think he does portray himself as this capable statesman, but he's also still a revolutionary at heart. And he needs to, even though he said the revolution is over, now we're trying to build a state. He still has, which is what Fidel Castro did, right? And he did it very successfully, at least to stay in power for decades, and the regime is still there. Is there such a thing as a Middle Eastern version of a Latino revolutionary?
I'm not sure if I know enough about Fidel Castro's past to to say yes or no, but I understand what you're saying, especially the visual of the khaki jacket.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what's clear is that al-Sharaa has been through sort of several phases. He had his jihadi phase where he went to Iraq. Then he had his phase where he was essentially running al-Qaeda in Syria. And then he made a move away from, those jihadists, outwardly jihadist networks, and tried to present himself as more of an alternative nationalist military figure who could rival Bashar al-Assad and also be seen to be someone who's palatable to external powers, which is, I think, probably the phase you're referring to when you're seeing him in his khaki military fatigues. He made a pretty quick transition as soon as he arrived in Damascus. I think the day he arrived, he went to the Umayyad Mosque, and
which is what I'm referring to. This is when I saw him in this. I think he was wearing a khaki jacket.
That's right.
It was so wild, almost people holding up Kalashnikovs, and it just had that revolution.
Yeah.
Again, the only thing for me missing was the cigar, and I think I might have seen a picture of him with a cigar anyway.
That's right.
And then he went to this historic place, and maybe tell us more about the importance of this location that he chose.
Yeah, so the Umayyad Mosque is right in the heart of the old city of Damascus. It's one of the first places. I think I went there on like my second day in Syria. Really ancient, historic mosque, has a massive sort of marble square, just a really rich sort of marquee landmark in Syria. So he went there and
it's an actual in-use mosque.
Yeah,
so
it is.
People still go there to pray and worship.
People go there to pray and worship, and you can also just enter as a tourist. You take your shoes off, walk around the square in your socks, and it's a really central part of Syrian
and
identity.
It obviously survived the civil war. So do you think it survived the civil war because of its significance?
I think it survived due to its physical location more than anything. It's in the heart of the regime's power base, which was Damascus and Latakia, which is on the coast. But Damascus, the inside of Damascus, I think, or the heart of Damascus, didn't see the fighting that other parts of Syria saw, although I think there are bullet holes around the mosque.
Yeah. Which I think is so deceiving, isn't it? Like when you watch the news now in the last couple of weeks and months in the second half of 25, and you've got, which is great to see those first civil developments happening in decades. And this is the second, third generation that has grown up under the same regime. So it's hard for people, plus they didn't have flourishing democracy before that either. It's really, really hard for a Westerner to understand how really basic for us, but challenging for them it is to simply get together, talk about politics without being worried of repercussions, any negative influences, impacts on your family, on yourself. And you see those images now in Western television, and you think, there's no war there. It all looks beautiful. They sit in cafe houses. And that is probably that part of Damascus that you're referring to, because when you see Aleppo and other places, it looks like a wasteland. Yeah,
that's right. And I mean, you can talk about the fall of Bashar al-Assad, but of course his father ruled Syria from, I think, 1971 is when he took formal power. But even before that, he was an Air Force commander and Minister of Defense. So the Assad family's sort of political power goes back right to the early 60s and mid-60s. But, I mean, the story even before that, between the period when Syria gained its independence in 1946 through to the rise of the Ba'ath Party and the Assads, there were coups through that period as well. So, I mean, if things go well now, and that's a big if, I'm sort of agnostic on the matter. It's really, for Syria, an opportunity for something that they haven't had ever. Yeah. If they can get that stability and sort of establish the functions of a democratic state. But just quickly back to al-Sharaa and his transformations.
Yes.
The day after he makes that speech, when he, moves from a phase of a military commander who's got this objective to take down the Assad government, he finally achieves that goal. He starts wearing a suit and a tie. So this is the final stage, I guess, where he's now trying to present as an international statesman. And a big part of that is the clothes he wears and the way he talks and the language he uses. So that's the phase we're seeing now.
Yeah.
But his ability to sort of shapeshift and, present as one thing at one period and present it as another thing at another time. For some people, might be, oh, well, he's reacting to events as he sees them. But for others, it might be, well, that's a deeply suspicious characteristic in a person that they will change their positions and not stick to something that they really believe in. If you can change that radically, then how do we trust that you won't change again?
The question, Jaron, when he was speaking at the mosque, was he still al-Julani or was he al-Sharaa?
I think he dropped.
Or was that the moment when he changed his name?
I think that's probably the historical moment where he changed from al-Julani to his birth name, al-Sharaa.
Yeah.
Ahmed Hussein. And sort of dropped. I mean, I think even when he was in Iraq, he wasn't using that Julani name. It was only when he returned to Syria and was tasked with, setting up al-Qaeda in Iraq that he drew on that, I've got Syrian heritage here. I'm from the Golan Heights, and by the way, the Golan Heights is occupied by Israel, so that adds another dimension to his usage of that history.
David, you've mentioned before the magic number. The magic number is 11. 11 days it took for things to change. 11 days it took after 13 years of civil war to bring the Assad regime to an absolute collapse, ending up on an airplane to Russia with his family. He got out there alive, just in the nick of time.
Again, as an outside observer with no real depth of knowledge of Syria and its politics, it did seem like a regime that wouldn't buckle. That others were different, and this was something that would never fall. Probably a lot like the West's approach to communism, the Berlin Wall, etc., in the early 80s, thinking that this was something that we are going to have to live with forever, but it can fall so quickly. So
and it all started on the 27th of November, just to give listeners an idea. So 27th of November is when everyone hopped on their trucks, loaded their guns in Idlib, where he was running this mini-state. And I think this is all the credibility he's drawing on ever since, that I've done this before on a small scale. I can do this for all of Syria. Like you said, it was a functioning mini-society, wasn't that, for quite a while? So there were civil services. People had, I think, a higher standard of living than the rest of the country, which
That's
was ironic that the president, backed by one of the most powerful countries in the world, didn't manage to provide that lifestyle, unlike those rebels who did. And it all started on the 27th of November, 24. And within 3 days, they took Aleppo. What happened with Assad in Aleppo? There was a history there.
I mean, to understand, we're really asking the question now, what were the conditions before the fall of Assad that made it so easy? I think the answers for that are pretty simple in hindsight. The country's economy was in ruins after 13, 14 years of fighting and the imposition of Western sanctions and the displacement, both internal and external, of 14 million people in your country. I mean, there's no way that you can sustain an economy under those conditions, which is why the regime, resorted to certain methods to try and raise funds. I think that some of the most well-known of those are there was a pretty well-known a shakedown of the business elite in 2019. So essentially a whole bunch of wealthy business figures were invited to the Sheraton Hotel in Damascus and basically told, you need to give us money or you're going to get arrested. So that went on for years. And simultaneously there was this entry by the regime into the production of Keptagon, which I think most people will be aware of now, but the government basically went into a full-time operation producing 80% of the world's Keptagon supply, which was exported through the port of Latakia on the coast and also across the border in the south of the country through to Jordan. So that was, I've read estimates that was raising anywhere between $5 to $50 billion annually for the regime. But of course, that kind of money doesn't spread out to people across society. That's, and I think that's partly why you can describe it as a sort of a mafioso type regime, heavily centralized in the Assad family. So that sort of led to a situation where the daily life for Syrians on an economic level was just unbearable. I think the monthly salary for government officials was $15 to $30 US dollars a month,
which is nothing in any country.
It's nothing
it's a joke.
No, that's right. And there were stories too of regime troops siphoning off fuel from their tanks to sort of sell to get by. So, this goes to, I think, the point of the military failure of the Assad regime. If people need something to fight for, and if you're not paying your troops and your troops aren't, even making enough money to survive, then why would they bother fighting for that kind of regime? So, yes, it was partly al-Sharaa and his forces heading from the north to the south, but by the same token, it was just a total collapse of the regime. And I think once the Russians and the Iranians saw that the Syrian troops and the Syrian army's not going to fight for itself, so what hope have we got in sort of propping up this regime any longer? And then
I do see all those, and here on this podcast we're allowed to go out there a bit, but I see all those parallels to the fall of Kabul. The Taliban, use their poppy seed farms also to fund their war efforts. A ragtag band of guys on the back of utes with Kalashnikovs, and the biggest powers in the world packed up. The whole thing collapsed, and within weeks there was a new regime that's still in place today. Very different outcome, obviously, with al-Sharaa seeking the secular approach that he does now, at least to a certain extent secular, like I said, or at least being tolerant of minorities.
Yeah,
and other views.
I think secular is probably too strong a word.
Yeah.
I'd say when you compare what he is saying about how he envisages Syria, which is often in response to questions from external voices, but also Syrians who have genuine aspirations for that kind of country. He's saying the right things about that, but I think his vision of what Syria would be would still be heavily influenced by his sort of background, his religious background.
Then on it went further south, to Hama fell, and then on the 6th of December, Dara, which is where it all started in 2011. And I remember waking up, watching news every morning, another city was falling, wasn't it? Like a house of cards, it came down. And you've just mentioned, and I've mentioned the word corruption before because I think it's so crucial to understand why those spreadsheets and numbers that are always brought up when a conflict builds up and you say, oh, they've got 5,000 tanks and they've got 3,000 tanks and they've got 1 million men in arms. But then what happens in real life is always so different, and often it is because of morale and it is because of corruption. And it might all look good on paper, and we've seen that with the invasion of Ukraine as well. Everyone thought it's a weak job for the Russians, and they're still there until this day. And what I've heard, and that's probably the last point I want to touch on today, is the implications. Because you said, before the war, Syria was a different country, and it's just radicalized every element of society. And obviously the Assad regime was the main driver behind that. By avoiding any form of dialogue, compromise, and just choosing a crackdown as the only choice, is that I've heard that unlike other states, oppressive regimes that have one secret service, KGB in the Soviet Union, the Stasi in Germany, Securitate in Romania, in Syria, up until now, there were many of them. The Air Force one, where Hafiz, the father, started his career, which apparently had the most powerful secret service where it all started. But then there was many other branches, and the other service had their own, and they were all competing, divide and rule sort of tactic. But in the end, it came to a stage where people were just arrested for ransom. So it got to a stage where it wasn't even about oppressing an opposition anymore. It was people became cash cows, and your own son just disappeared on the way home from school. And unless you paid up, you never saw him again. Have you heard stories like this before?
I mean, I think that's interesting too about the use of the word corruption because, when we talk about corruption, often we think about a behavior or a set of actions that are completely at odds with, a mainstream expectation about how government should function and what's right about a government. But when you have a regime like the Assad regime, which is its foundation is corruption, then the whole machinery of the state is corrupt. So that, it's the founding principle of a regime like that is corruption. So I think now that is gone, the question of corruption is there, but I think
how do you wipe that out? How do you eradicate entrenched corruption that has been part of a system for generations?
My main point is that now that the Assad regime is gone, which was at heart a corrupt regime, that's going to be a lot easier.
It can't get worse. Is that your message?
Well, no, I think it can get a lot better.
Yeah,
I think, and it can get a lot better very quickly.
Now, what I've talked about before is the regime has fallen. Al-Sharaa has a unique historic opportunity. I think we are giving him a chance. That's sort of what I'm taking from today. I think he might be there for the right reasons.
I mean, we have no choice but to hope for the best. I mean, it's tempting in political analysis to, I've got a whole bunch of values that I bring to any discussion. The reality is he's the guy that's there now.
Yeah.
And he's saying a whole bunch of things about where he thinks Syria is going to go. I hope that, he sticks to that and the country does head in that direction. But there's no guarantees that it will. Yeah. There is, I will say that there's a lot of people now or a lot of actors that have a lot riding on his success. The Turks, the US, countries in the Gulf.
Everyone came to the party quite quickly, wasn't it? The Europeans as well. They were on the plane as soon as he entered the palace.
Yeah, so that bodes well. There isn't, except for Israel, which I think, as I say, there's some discussions going on now. But if at least they don't have external actors actively trying to undermine, this fledgling state, then I think that puts them in a better position.
Which is obviously helped by the distractions still happening in Ukraine and also in Gaza. I think if it wasn't for those two conflicts, there might be more of a scrutiny around him. Last thing I want to talk about today is we talked about the resources, we talked about the politics. Let's talk about the people. I can barely imagine another people that have undergone so much trauma and injury over such a long time. 13 years is very long for a war that just never really stopped. Yes, we had the feeling about a year or 2 or 3 years ago that Assad has won and it's calming down, but it never obviously did. Plus, the majority of young, capable people have all left. They're all abroad, and you're friends with quite a few of them. Now, you have a highly, highly traumatized population. There are many scores to be settled still. How do you work with that?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, Syrians I know who are now living in third countries.
Yeah.
I think, there's mixed reactions. Some Syrians were like, "Great, I'm heading straight there.
Yeah.
This is our chance, and I want to get my feet on the ground and help build my country." That was sort of one reaction I've seen. Others are more cautious. I'm going to wait and see how things play out over the next couple of years because it's a big deal to move. If you've set up roots in Europe or elsewhere, to then just to leave and go back to Syria, you don't want to risk a repeat of sort of the traumas that you've already experienced. So there's that cohort who are sort of waiting for Syria and hoping for the best and maybe thinking that at some point in the future they'll go back. But there's millions and millions of Syrians, as you mentioned, outside the country, but I think all of them at least share the wish that the country succeeds. And
we do also want to recognize that there has been sectarian violence since. There was incidents in June and July with hundreds of people killed again. Who's really at fault, we don't know. Or there's various claims. Again, he's got a very, very interesting mix of people that are fighting for him. They need to be appeased, paid off in some form. And now's the time to set up the new Syria. And of course, there will be people with wrong intentions there too.
I'm glad you mentioned that because there have been, it wasn't like since the fall of the regime, everything's just gone swimmingly since then.
Yeah.
There have been abuses and massacres. And there've been, investigations, independent investigations, and the regime's done its own investigations into what caused that. And al-Sharaa the regime has said that there will be, justice for those who have committed crimes. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen. But yeah, it's a fragile situation. That's for sure.
I'm hoping that he stays the course. I'm hoping that he has that feeling, that sensitivity around international relations. I can't predict Netanyahu. It's just that he's unpredictable, just as Trump is at the moment. And because he clearly has the power to take him out whenever he wants to at the moment. But I do hope that the situation stabilizes, because now is the time of a new beginning as well. And I can totally understand in expat communities how people say, we got to go there now, because this, in as history shows, is usually the time when you want to be there. You want to set up shop. Obviously, all the high government posts are now available because you can't really work with the people that were there before.
The other thing to be said is at the end of this transitional period, which I think now probably has about 4 years to run, it was a 5-year transitional period that was set up. That we're going through. And then I think the intention is after that 5 years, it'll start functioning the way other states function, regular, full-scale elections, that sort of thing. So the question for me is at that point, what sort of political life are we going to be witnessing in Syria? Are there going to be competing parties? Are we going to have secular parties? How is political power going to be divided? What is sort of the sharing of political power in terms of political parties and those sorts of affiliations going to be when we see full-scale national elections, and how many Syrians who are currently living abroad who've got an interest in Syria are going to be back in the country, and will those who are living outside the country be able to participate? So all those sorts of things are things to watch.
Maybe a Lebanese model, when it ever functioned, but the Lebanese model of power sharing between the different religions and sections of society, where there's quotas in place to represent minorities.
Possibly, although I think the sort of ethnic divisions are much different in Syria. It's got a 75% Sunni majority. And the civil war has mixed all that up anyway. Again, who's got any reliable, credible numbers, statistics on Syria? I don't think anyone does. Now, you are listening to Putschcast, of course. Thank you for spending so much time with us on our first inaugural episode. We are trying to establish little traditions here at Putschcast, and one of them is to define what we've talked about today. Number one is, was it a putsch?
I'd say it was, based on the fact that it was a forceful military overthrow of an existing regime, yes.
Second question, was it a successful one?
So far. But
yeah, I would classify it as a successful one. If your measure of success is that you wanted to get rid of a brutal dictator who'd been sort of hijacked the country for decades, then yes.
And the third question is, was it a bloody or a velvet one?
I mean, contextually, if you're looking at that part of the world and transitions of power, it's probably as bloodless as you're going to get.
Yeah, if you start the tape, on the 27th of November, you can look at it that way. You could also put the tape back to 2011 and say
one of the worst.
That was, just the final piece of a long 14-year bloody revolution.
I think that is really important, that context, to see. Because often in history, we don't know when the conflict, we know when it started, but you never really know when it finished, right? And sometimes conflicts just get frozen and they never get resolved. And as they say, the next war is built on a bad peace accord. So we'll see what happens next. So thank you for answering those questions, because that helps us to tag this particular episode on our website, putschcast.com. Syria, the country that will surely pop up many more times on Putschcast. And I'm proud to share here that there will be another episode coming up very soon where we will take a closer look at the Assad regime, and we take a behind-the-scenes look, as we will be talking to Luke Waters. Luke Waters used to be a journalist at Dateline. That's a program in Australia, very well-renowned foreign affairs program, and he worked for a public broadcaster there, and he was one of the first Western journalists in the middle of the war to be invited to Syria, to Damascus, to speak face-to-face with Assad in English. I can also recommend you to watch that video maybe beforehand. And Luke has promised to give us some real good insights into what it was like. How the hell do you line up an interview with a dictator? How do you get there? What is the security protocol? And did you feel safe doing it? So we'll hear about that. And I think we hopefully one day we'll find out what happened to him, because I'm not quite sure where he is, what he's doing. Is he still alive? Yes, apparently he lives on the outskirts of Moscow in a villa, but you never know. You never know. And there are rumors he's getting divorced as well, and that his wife's trying to go back to the UK.
I was just going to raise the divorce rumor, yeah.
Yeah. That was Putschcast, episode number 1. I want to thank my guests, Jaron Sutton,
Thanks,
and my
Oliver.
co-host, who you will hear again, hopefully on the next one with Luke. And if you have any suggestions, send us an email, putschcast@gmail.com. Visit our website, putschcast.com, and also follow us on socials. We are on Instagram, we are on Facebook, and of course, we are also on YouTube. No video at this stage, because we're still looking for more sponsors to make this happen. But we have sponsors already, and I want to thank Motorcycle Rental Melbourne very much for making this episode happen today. Every dollar helps. And if you want to make a difference, again, reach out to us and suggest a topic as well. Unfortunately, we will never run out of content on this podcast because world history keeps evolving. My name is Oliver, hosting Putschcast for you today. I want to thank you for listening, and don't forget to check out our social channels.